Chapter 1. Golden Hour. The late afternoon sun painted the suburban streets in warm, golden light, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. Clara and Chloe Thompson, 7-year-old twins with matching sky-blue helmets, pedaled their bikes around the quiet cul-de-sac. Their laughter echoed through the peaceful neighborhood as they raced each other in circles, their matching ponytails swaying with each push of the pedals. "You can't catch me, Chloe," Clara called out, her ponytail bouncing as she pedaled faster. Her bright green bike sparkled in the sunlight, decorative tassels flowing from the handlebars like ribbons dancing in the breeze. Chloe, riding her identical orange bike, leaned forward with determination. "Just watch," she grinned, picking up speed. The wind whistled past her ears as she pedaled harder, gaining on her sister. From the front porch, Sarah Thompson watched her daughters with a gentle smile, her heart swelling with pride and love. She sat in her favorite Adirondack chair, a mug of herbal tea warming her hands. The sight of her girls playing so freely helped ease the tension from her shoulders after a long week at the hospital. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. "Be careful, girls," she called out when Clara took a turn a bit too sharply. But her warning held more warmth than worry. These peaceful moments were precious to her, snapshots of childhood joy she wished she could freeze in time. The twins continued their game, weaving patterns across the street. Their bikes hummed against the pavement as they rode, occasionally hitting small bumps that made them giggle and bounce in their seats. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of their joy and the distant chirping of birds in the oak trees that lined the street. Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor with snow-white hair neatly pulled back into a bun, appeared at the corner of the street. She walked slowly, her sensible shoes clicking against the sidewalk as she carried a small shopping bag from her usual afternoon walk to the local market. "Hi, Mrs. Henderson," the twins called out in unison, waving enthusiastically as they passed her, their voices bright and cheerful. Mrs. Henderson looked up and offered a small wave back, but her wrinkled face didn't hold its usual warmth. Instead, her eyes darted around distractedly, and she clutched her shopping bag closer to her chest, her knuckles white against the brown paper. The twins didn't notice anything unusual, lost in their own world of make-believe races. They were too caught up in their game, continuing to circle the cul-de-sac as Mrs. Henderson made her way to her house, 3 doors down, her steps slightly quicker than usual. "Girls, 10 more minutes," Sarah called from the porch. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting orange streaks across the sky and turning the clouds into cotton candy colors. "Okay, Mom," Chloe shouted back, while Clara made one last victory lap around their imaginary racetrack, her arms raised in triumph. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Night. The evening passed quietly, filled with the normal routines of family life. After dinner, the twins headed upstairs to get ready for bed, their earlier energy mellowing into sleepy contentment. They stood side by side at their bathroom sink, brushing their teeth with matching ladybug toothbrushes, their pajamas decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars. "I almost won that last race," Clara said through a mouthful of toothpaste, her eyes meeting her sister's in the mirror. Chloe giggled, accidentally dribbling some toothpaste down her chin. "Did not." She wiped her chin with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of white. As they rinsed their mouths, they heard their mother's voice floating up from downstairs. She was on the phone, her tone different from her usual cheerful evening calls with their Aunt Susan. There was an edge to it that made both girls pause. "Are you sure?" they heard Sarah say, her voice trembling slightly. "But that doesn't make any sense." The worry in her words was clear, even from upstairs. The twins exchanged curious looks in the bathroom mirror, their toothbrushes forgotten in their hands. Clara reached over and turned off the faucet so they could hear better, the sudden silence making their mother's voice seem even louder. "Yes, I understand," Sarah continued, her voice growing fainter as she moved around downstairs. "But they were just, no, I see. Yes, I'll be there first thing." Her footsteps paced back and forth across the kitchen floor. The girls couldn't make out the rest of the conversation, but they could hear the worry in their mother's voice. It was the kind of tone she used when something was really wrong, like the time Chloe had gotten lost at the supermarket. It was her serious voice, the one that made their stomachs twist with concern. "What's wrong with Mom?" Chloe whispered to Clara, her earlier playfulness replaced with concern. She grabbed her sister's hand, seeking comfort in the familiar touch. Clara shrugged, but she felt a small knot forming in her stomach. "Maybe she's just tired from work," she suggested, trying to sound more confident than she felt. They finished getting ready for bed in unusual silence, both straining to hear more of their mother's conversation. When the phone finally clicked into its cradle downstairs, they heard their mother let out a long, shaky breath that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Chapter 3. A Rude Awakening. The early morning silence was broken by thunderous knocking at the front door at 6:40 a.m. Chloe stirred in her bed, pulling her floral comforter closer as she tried to make sense of the noise. Her heart pounded against her chest as the knocking grew more insistent. Across the room, Clara sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her long blonde hair tangled from restless dreams. "What's that sound?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She clutched her favorite stuffed giraffe tighter to her chest. Before Chloe could answer, they heard their mother's footsteps rushing down the hallway. The quick padding of bare feet against carpet followed by the sound of the front door opening. Voices filled their usually peaceful home, echoing off the walls like angry thunder. "Mrs. Thompson, step aside," a deep voice commanded, leaving no room for argument. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, each thud making the twins' hearts race faster. Chloe and Clara exchanged worried glances as their bedroom door burst open with a bang that made them both jump. Two police officers in dark uniforms towered in the doorway, their faces stern and unyielding in the dim morning light that filtered through their polka-dot curtains. "These are the ones," one officer said to the other, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. They moved swiftly into the room, their heavy boots leaving marks on the pale carpet. "What's happening?" Chloe cried out as rough hands pulled her from her bed. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around her small wrists, biting into her skin. Beside her, Clara began to sob as she received the same treatment, her stuffed giraffe falling forgotten to the floor. "Mommy!" Clara screamed, tears streaming down her face, leaving wet trails on her cheeks. Their mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock, still wearing her flowered nightgown from the night before. "Stop this. They're just children," Sarah pleaded, following the officers as they led the twins down the stairs. The nightmare had just begun. Chapter 4. Taken Away. Sarah's pleas were ignored. The officers, stone-faced and unwavering, escorted Clara and Chloe, their small hands cuffed behind their backs. Down the stairs. The indignity of it all, the coldness, the utter disbelief etched on the twins' faces, twisted Sarah's heart into a knot of agony. Neighbors began to peek out from their windows, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Henderson, standing on her porch, watched with a mixture of confusion and concern, her brow furrowed. "What's going on, Sarah?" Mr. Johnson, the retired postman who lived across the street, called out, his voice laced with worry. Sarah, her voice choked with tears, could only shake her head. "I don't know," she managed to whisper. "I just don't know." The officers didn't offer any explanation. They efficiently ushered the twins into the back of a police car, the metallic clang of the door slamming shut echoing through the quiet street. Sarah tried to follow, to get into the car with her daughters, but one of the officers stopped her, his hand firm on her arm. "You can't come with them, ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll be contacted with further instructions." Sarah watched, helpless, as the police car pulled away from the curb, the red and blue lights flashing in the morning sun. Her daughters' faces, pale and frightened, were pressed against the back window, their eyes wide with terror. As the car disappeared around the corner, Sarah collapsed onto the sidewalk, sobbing uncontrollably. Chapter 5. The investigation begins. Back at the police station, Clara and Chloe were separated. The sterile environment, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the unfamiliar faces only amplified their fear. Clara was led into a small, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. A female officer, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, sat across from her. "Hello, Clara," the officer said softly. "My name is Officer Davis. Can I call you Clara?" Clara, still trembling, nodded slightly. "We just need to ask you a few questions, okay? It will help us understand what's going on." Clara looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Where's my mommy? Where's Chloe?" "Your mommy is okay," Officer Davis reassured her. "And Chloe is safe. She's in another room, talking to another officer. We'll bring you both back together soon. I promise." Officer Davis proceeded to ask Clara about the previous day, about their games, about their neighbors. She asked about Mrs. Henderson. Specifically, "Do you see Mrs. Henderson often?" "Yes," Clara replied. "She always says hi. She gives us cookies sometimes." "Did you see her yesterday?" "Yes. We waved to her when we were riding our bikes." "Did you notice anything different about her?" Clara hesitated. She looked sad, and she was holding her bag really tight. Meanwhile, in another room, Chloe was being questioned by a male officer, Officer Miller. He took a more direct approach, his questions sharper and more pointed. "Chloe, did you see anyone go into Mrs. Henderson's house yesterday?" Chloe shook her head. "No, we were just playing." "Did you see anyone near her house? Anyone suspicious?" Chloe struggled to remember. "I don't know. Maybe. I didn't really pay attention." "Think hard, Chloe. It's important." Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, tried to recall anything that might be helpful. "I saw a car parked down the street. A black car, but I don't know who it belonged to." Chapter 6. A Mother's Despair. Back at home, Sarah was a whirlwind of frantic energy. She called her sister, Susan, who lived a few hours away, and pleaded with her to come immediately. She contacted a lawyer, Mr. Evans, a seasoned attorney who had helped her family with legal matters in the past. Mr. Evans arrived within the hour, his face grim. "Tell me everything, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. Sarah recounted the events of the morning, her voice breaking with emotion. She described the police officers, the handcuffs, the chilling way they had taken her daughters away. "They wouldn't tell me anything," she sobbed. "They just said I'd be contacted. I don't understand. What could my girls have possibly done?" Mr. Evans listened patiently, taking notes. "I'll find out what's going on, Sarah," he said. "I'll go down to the police station and try to get some answers. In the meantime, try to stay calm. It's important that you're strong for your daughters." As Mr. Evans left, Susan arrived, her face etched with worry. She wrapped Sarah in a tight embrace. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice full of compassion. "What has happened?" Sarah, overwhelmed with relief, clung to her sister. "I don't know, Susan," she cried. "I just don't know." Together, they waited, pacing the floor, making endless cups of tea, and praying for any news about Clara and Chloe. The silence in the house, once filled with the joyous sounds of her daughter's laughter, was now deafening. Chapter 7. Unraveling the Mystery. Mr. Evans arrived at the police station and demanded to speak with the officers in charge of the case. After some initial resistance, he was finally granted a meeting with Detective Harding, a hardened veteran with a reputation for being tough but fair. "What's the basis for detaining my clients, Clara and Chloe Thompson?" "Mr. Evans demanded, his voice firm. "They are 7-year-old children. What possible threat could they pose?" Detective Harding leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Henderson, their neighbor, was found murdered in her home this morning. The twins are considered persons of interest." Mr. Evans was stunned. "Murdered? Mrs. Henderson? But she was such a sweet old lady." "That may be," Detective Harding replied. "But she's dead, and the Thompson twins were the last people known to have seen her alive." "That's absurd," Mr. Evans protested. "They were just waving to her from across the street. They didn't even go near her house." "We have reason to believe they may know more than they're letting on," Detective Harding said, his voice flat. "They're being questioned. We'll see what they have to say." "Those girls are terrified," Mr. Evans countered. "They're children. You can't expect them to understand what's going on. They need their mother. Their mother will be allowed to see them as soon as we've finished our investigation." Detective Harding said, his voice dismissive. In the meantime, I suggest you advise your clients to cooperate fully. Mr. Evans left the police station feeling frustrated and deeply concerned. The situation was far more serious than he had initially imagined. He knew he had to find a way to get the twins released and back with their mother as soon as possible. Chapter 8. Conflicting Accounts. Back in the interrogation rooms, the officers continued their questioning. They pressed Clara and Chloe for details, trying to find any inconsistencies in their stories. Clara, you said you waved to Mrs. Henderson. Did you talk to her at all? Officer Davis asked gently. No, Clara replied. We just waved. Did you see anyone else near her house? Any strangers? Clara hesitated. I don't know. I don't remember. Think hard, Clara. It's important. Did you see anyone go inside her house? Clara shook her head. No. In the other room, Officer Miller was taking a different approach with Chloe. He was more aggressive, his tone more accusatory. Chloe, are you sure you're telling us the truth? Did you see anyone go into Mrs. Henderson's house? Chloe, intimidated by his stern demeanor, began to cry. I don't know, she sobbed. Maybe? I don't remember. Chloe, it's very important that you tell us the truth. Did you see anyone? Chloe, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, blurted out the first thing that came to her mind. I saw a man, a big man. He was wearing a hat. Officer Miller leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Aman and Ahat? What did he look like? Chloe, realizing she had said something she shouldn't have, began to panic. I don't know. I don't remember. Please, I want my mommy. The conflicting accounts from the twins only deepened the detective's suspicions. They believed that the girls were withholding information, possibly to protect someone. Chapter 9. Released, but not free. After hours of questioning, Mr. Evans managed to secure the release of Clara and Chloe. He argued that they were children, traumatized by the events of the day, and that further interrogation would only be detrimental to their well-being. Detective Harding reluctantly agreed, but warned that the investigation was ongoing and that the twins were still considered persons of interest. They were free to go home, but they were not free from suspicion. Sarah, her face pale and drawn, rushed to the police station to pick up her daughters. When she saw them, their small faces streaked with tears, she wrapped them in a tight embrace, burying her face in their hair. My babies, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I'm so glad you're safe. As they drove home, the twins sat in the back seat, silent and withdrawn. The joy and laughter that usually filled the car were replaced by an unsettling quiet. They had been through a terrifying ordeal, and the experience had left them deeply shaken. Back at home, Sarah tried to create a sense of normalcy, making their favorite dinner and reading them bedtime stories. But the atmosphere was heavy with tension and fear. The twins were jumpy and anxious, clinging to their mother and refusing to let her out of their sight. Sarah knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed. They were no longer just innocent children playing in their quiet suburban neighborhood. They were now suspects in a murder investigation. Chapter 10. The Shadow of Suspicion. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and dread. The police continued their investigation, questioning neighbors and searching Mrs. Henderson's house for clues. The media descended on the quiet cul-de-sac, turning it into a scene of chaos and speculation. Sarah tried to shield her daughters from the attention, keeping them inside and away from the prying eyes of the reporters. But the shadow of suspicion hung over them, tainting everything they did. Neighbors who had once been friendly and welcoming now avoided them, casting furtive glances and whispering behind their backs. The twins, once popular and well-liked, were now ostracized and feared. At school, they were taunted and bullied by their classmates, who called them murderers and killers. The teachers, unsure of how to handle the situation, kept their distance, treating them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Sarah watched helplessly as her daughters retreated into themselves, their bright spirits dimmed by the weight of the accusations. She knew she had to do something to clear their names and restore their lives. Chapter 11. Searching for the truth. Determined to prove her daughter's innocence, Sarah decided to conduct her own investigation. She spoke to Mrs. Henderson's friends and neighbors, trying to piece together a picture of her life and to uncover any possible enemies. She learned that Mrs. Henderson was a kind and generous woman who had lived in the neighborhood for many years. She had no known enemies and was well respected by everyone who knew her. However, Sarah also discovered that Mrs. Henderson had recently been receiving strange phone calls and had seemed increasingly anxious and fearful. She had told a few friends that she was being followed and that she suspected someone was watching her house. Sarah realized that Mrs. Henderson may have been the target of a stalker or a harasser, and that her murder may have been the result of something completely unrelated to her daughters. She shared this information with Mr. Evans, who in turn presented it to Detective Harding. However, Detective Harding remained skeptical. He pointed out that there was no concrete evidence to support Sarah's theory and that the twins were still the prime suspects in the case. Chapter 12. A break in the case. Just when Sarah was beginning to lose hope, a break in the case occurred. A local pawn shop owner contacted the police, reporting that a man had recently tried to sell him a piece of jewelry that matched the description of a necklace that Mrs. Henderson had been wearing on the day of her murder. The police arrested the man, a drifter with a long criminal record. After hours of interrogation, he confessed to breaking into Mrs. Henderson's house to steal her valuables. He claimed that he had panicked when she confronted him and had accidentally killed her in the struggle. The police quickly determined that the man's story was consistent with the evidence. They found Mrs. Henderson's stolen jewelry in his possession and were able to match his fingerprints to those found at the crime scene. With the arrest of the drifter, Clara and Chloe were finally cleared of suspicion. The police issued a public apology to the Thompson family, acknowledging that the twins had been wrongly accused. Chapter 13. Healing and moving on. The Thompson family was relieved that the truth had finally come out, but the ordeal had left deep scars. Clara and Chloe struggled to cope with the trauma of being accused of murder and ostracized by their community. Sarah enrolled them in therapy, where they learned to process their emotions and to rebuild their self-esteem. Slowly but surely, they began to heal and to regain their sense of innocence. The community, once quick to judge, rallied around the Thompson family, offering their support and forgiveness. The neighbors organized a block party to welcome the twins back and show them that they were loved and valued. It took time, but Clara and Chloe eventually were able to move on with their lives. They learned to forgive those who had wronged them and to focus on the future. They never forgot the nightmare they had endured, but they refused to let it define them. Sarah, too, was deeply affected by the experience. She learned the importance of standing up for her children and of fighting for justice. She became an advocate for children's rights and dedicated her life to helping other families who had been wrongly accused. The Thompson family story was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the power of love and forgiveness. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still prevail.